Suppose I told you I could prove that God exists, or for that matter, prove that God doesn't exist. You would be right to be skeptical. People have been trying to do exactly that thing for over 2,000 years, and yet we don't seem to be any closer to a knockdown argument either way. But here's a question that almost never gets asked, and it's the question that's going to occupy us in this series. What if proof was the wrong target the whole time? What if the right question isn't, can we prove God exists? But rather, does the evidence we already have make God's existence more likely than it would be otherwise? That shift from proof to probability is the move at the heart of Richard Swinburne's book, The Existence of God. It's one of the most important works in philosophy of religion in the last 50 years. And over the course of this series, we're going to work through it together, chapter by chapter. Today, the framework, the rules of the game. Because before you can ask whether the case for God is any good, you have to know what counts as a good case in the first place. A quick word about why this book is worth your time. Richard Swinburne taught at Oxford University for decades. He's a philosopher of religion, but he's also deeply trained in the philosophy of science. And what he did, starting in the 1970s, was something genuinely new. He took the old tools that scientists and historians use to evaluate evidence, the formal machinery of probability and confirmation, and he applied them to the question of God's existence. Whether you end up agreeing with him or not, his approach reframed the entire debate. You can't seriously discuss arguments for or against God today without engaging with the kind of framework that Swinburne built. So that's what we're going to do. Chapter 1 doesn't argue for God's existence, not yet. What it does is something more fundamental. It sets up the rules. It tells us what kind of argument we should even be looking for. So let's get into it. Let's start with the most basic distinction in logic: deductive versus inductive arguments. A deductive argument is one where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. There's no wiggle room. Here's a classic example. Premise 1, no material object travels faster than light. Premise 2, my car is a material object. So the conclusion, 3, my car doesn't travel faster than light. If you accept the premises, you have to accept the conclusion. Deductive arguments deliver a special property called validity when they work. What that means is that there's no way the premises can be true and the conclusion can be false. Now contrast that with an inductive argument. In an inductive argument, the premises don't guarantee the conclusion. They support it. They make the conclusion more likely to be true. Here's the kind of reasoning involved with an inductive argument. Every raven anyone has ever seen has been black, so all ravens are black. Now that conclusion could be wrong, even though the premise is true. Maybe somewhere there's a white raven no one's spotted yet, but the evidence still supports the conclusion. It makes it more reasonable to believe than disbelieve. Almost everything we think we know about the world, every scientific theory, every historical claim, every prediction about tomorrow, rests on inductive arguments, not deductive ones. The sun rising tomorrow, inductive. Evolution by natural selection, inductive. The defendant probably committed the crime, inductive. And here's Swinburne's first big move. The serious arguments about God's existence are almost all inductive arguments. They are not deductive ones. That sounds like a concession. It isn't. It's a reframing. Because if we have been demanding a deductive proof on either side, we've been demanding something that almost no important question can deliver. So let's talk about two kinds of inductive support. Now Swinburne does something subtle here that I want to slow down on because it pays off later. He says inductive support actually comes in two varieties. Two different things we might mean when we say the evidence supports the conclusion. We can call the first kind flavor 1. Let's call these P inductive arguments. A P inductive argument is one where the premises make the conclusion more probable than not. More than 50-50. If the argument works, You should believe the conclusion. Here's an example. 70% of people in this neighborhood are Catholic. Doherty lives in this neighborhood, so Doherty is Catholic. Now, the argument doesn't prove that Doherty is Catholic, but it makes it more likely than not. If you had to bet, you'd bet that he was Catholic. That's a P-inductive argument. Second kind of inductive argument, we might call flavor 2, C-inductive arguments. A C-inductive argument is weaker. Here, the premises raise the probability of the conclusion, but they don't push it above the 50-50 threshold. They just have to make the conclusion more likely to be true than it would otherwise be. Here's the intuition. Imagine I deal you a playing card face down from the standard deck. What's the probability that it's a jack? 1 in 13. Now I tell you it's a face card. Has the probability that it's a jack gone up? Yes. From 1 in 13 to 1 in 3. Did I prove that it was a jack? No. It's still more likely not a jack than otherwise. But the evidence confirms the hypothesis. It raises its probability. And that's what a C-inductive argument does. It confirms. It moves the needle. You can think of this distinction as a P-inductive argument is one that makes the conclusion probable, and a C-inductive argument is one that confirms the conclusion. It raises its probability. So why does the distinction matter? Here's why Swinburne cares about it. Most arguments for God's existence, taken one at a time, are probably not strong enough to be P-inductive. The cosmological argument alone won't get you above 50-50. That's arguable, but let's go along with Swinburne's assumption. The argument from design alone won't get you there either. But that doesn't mean that those arguments are worthless. Each one might be a successful C-inductive argument. Each one might raise the probability that God exists, even if it doesn't by itself push it over the line. And that opens up the most important move in the entire book. Part 3, the cumulative case. There's a tempting bad argument in philosophy of religion. It goes like this. The cosmological argument doesn't prove that God exists. The design argument doesn't prove that God exists. The moral argument doesn't prove that God exists. Therefore, the arguments for God's existence just don't work. Swinburne calls this the divide and rule strategy, and he says it's a mistake. Here's why. Imagine you're a detective. There's been a murder. You have 3 pieces of evidence about the suspect. There's blood on his hands. He had a motive. He stood to inherit a fortune. He was near the scene of the crime around the time it happened. Take any one of those pieces of evidence in isolation. Blood on the hands, could be from cutting himself shaving. Motive, lots of people have motives. Near the scene of the crime, so were 100 other people. But put all those 3 together, bloody hands, motive, opportunity, and now you have a serious case. The evidence combines. Each piece on its own is weak. Together, they're powerful. This is how science works. This is how history works. This is how juries work. And Swinburne's claim is that this is how we should evaluate the case for God too. So here's the strategy of the book. We're going to take each argument for God's existence, the cosmological argument, the design argument, the argument from consciousness, the argument from moral truths, miracles, religious experience, and we're going to ask each one, does this raise the probability that God exists? Is it a successful C-inductive argument? And then, at the very end, we ask the big question. When you put all of those together, when you stack the cumulative evidence, does the total case make God's existence more probable than not? Is the cumulative case a P-inductive argument? That's the project. Before we move on, I want to clear away 3 confusions that come up over and over in conversation about this stuff. If we don't get these straight, nothing in the rest of the series will land right. Confusion 1, but the evidence is compatible with atheism, so it doesn't support theism. You'll hear this constantly. Sure, the universe exists, but atheism is also consistent with the universe existing, so the existence of the universe isn't evidence for God. That sounds reasonable, but it's wrong. Of course, the evidence for any inductive argument is compatible with the opposite conclusion. That's what makes the argument inductive rather than deductive. If the evidence ruled out the alternative completely, you'd have a deductive argument, not an inductive one. By this logic, no scientific evidence could ever support any scientific theory. the fingerprints on the gun are compatible with the suspect being innocent. They could be planted after all. But of course, the fingerprints still raise the probability that the suspect is guilty. Compatibility with the alternative isn't a defeater. It's just what induction looks like. Confusion too. But that evidence supports some rival theory equally well. Here's the second confusion. Someone says, yes, fine, the order of the universe might raise the probability that God exists, but it equally raises the probability of, I don't know, some impersonal cosmic principle. So it's not really evidence for God. But evidence can confirm multiple hypotheses at the same time. That's entirely normal. Imagine 3 suspects, Smith, Brown, and Robinson. You know one of them did it. Now I prove that Robinson has an airtight alibi. What's happened to the probability that Smith did it? It went up. What's happened to the probability that Brown did it? It went up. The same piece of evidence confirmed 2 different and incompatible hypotheses. So the right question is never, does this evidence only support theism? The right question is, when you look at all the evidence and all the candidate explanations, which one comes out on top? Confusion 3. But arguments for God don't all reach the same conclusion. Sometimes critics say the cosmological argument, even if it works, just gets you to some kind of necessary being. The design argument just gets you to some kind of architect. The argument from miracles just gets you to some kind of supernatural agent. These are different conclusions. So, what good is it to add them up? Swinburne's response is sharp. Yes, each individual argument, taken alone, supports a narrower conclusion most strongly. But that's true in science too. Take Einstein's general theory of relativity. The shift in Mercury's orbit by itself doesn't best support general relativity. It best supports a simpler hypothesis, like there's an unknown planet near Mercury. The bending of starlight near the sun by itself best supports some narrower hypothesis. But put together, the cumulative pattern of all the evidence is best explained by general relativity, even though no additional or individual piece of evidence points there most strongly. Same structure with theism. Each argument by itself might most strongly support some narrower hypothesis, but the cumulative picture, Swinburne will argue, points to a full-blown personal God. I want to close with the deepest move in chapter 1, the move that sets up everything that comes after. Swinburne points out that all the major arguments for God's existence have a common structure. They're all what philosophers call arguments to the best explanation. The cosmological argument says the existence of the universe needs an explanation, and God's, having created it, explains it. The design argument says the order and fine-tuning of the universe needs an explanation, and God's, having designed it, explains it. The argument from consciousness says the existence of minds needs an explanation, and God's, having created conscious beings, explains it. In every case, there's a feature of the world, there's a candidate explanation, and we're asking whether the explanation is a good one. Now here's the crucial point. There are 2 very different kinds of explanation we use all the time, in everyday life and in science. The first, Swinburne calls scientific explanation. You explain something by appealing to laws plus prior conditions. The window broke because a rock hit it at a certain speed. Given the laws of physics, that's what happens when rocks hit windows. The second he calls personal explanations. You explain something by appealing to an agent who did it on purpose, for a reason. Why was there a sandwich on the counter? Because I made it, because I was hungry. That's not a story about laws of nature, that's a story about a person with intentions doing something for a reason. Both kinds of explanations are real, both are legitimate, and this is the key. Theism is fundamentally a personal explanation. The claim isn't that God is a law of nature. The claim is that God is a person, an agent with knowledge, with intentions, who acts for reasons. So when we evaluate arguments for God's existence, we're evaluating the claim that personal explanation is the best kind of explanation for certain large-scale features of reality. That sets up the next lecture, where we dig into what personal explanation actually is, how it differs from scientific explanation, and how to compare them. So here's where we are. Swinburne has set the table. He has told us the arguments worth taking seriously are inductive, not deductive. They come in two strengths. They can confirm or they can make probable. They work cumulatively, not in isolation. They face common objections that turn out on inspection not to be very good objections. And they all have a common structure. They're arguments that God provides the best personal explanation for features of the world we already know about. None of that by itself shows that God exists, but it tells us what kind of case we're looking for and what would count as success. In the next lecture, we'll dig into Swinburne's account of explanation, the difference between scientific and personal explanation, and why he thinks the distinction matters so much. If you found this helpful, I'd love it if you would subscribe. There's a whole series coming, and drop a comment with what you think. Is Swinburne right that we should give up on deductive proof here? Or is something lost when we settle just for probability? I'll see you in the next one.